Well, I'll introduce us first because it's not gone over on my. I can't see a different thing to present. Okay, that's better. All right. Okay, so I'm Jamie Wood. I'm from the School of History and Heritage, and I've got two students who are going to be not involved in the presentation, but will be there to answer questions because they've done some of the research that we're going to report on today. And Annabelle and Samantha are both students of classical studies in the School of History and Heritage. So I'm going to very briefly introduce the project, what we've been working on. It was a kind of bigger project, but I'm going to focus on kind of some of our Lincoln-specific findings wherever possible, balancing student and staff perspectives. We're going to look at, in terms of online reading, we're going to think about what staff and students think are the advantages of it. And then we're going to think about the practices that they described to us in the survey that we did around kind of the pedagogy around online reading and the learning that students feel like they're doing when they engage in online reading. Can we move on to the next slide, Ben, please? So the Active Online Reading Project has been going for nearly a year now. It's part of a scheme that's funded by the QAA called the Collaborative Enhancement Scheme. And it's all about kind of sharing good practice across institutions and disciplines, that scheme in particular. So our idea was to build on some of the good practice that we've developed in history at Lincoln and several other institutions, and the work that we've been doing with Talis around the use of Talis Elevate in particular, to share what we've learned around how students learn online, read online in particular, and also how what kind of innovative and effective pedagogies we might have identified during that process. So we're working across disciplines and institutions. We're also interested in issues of transition. So we're working with teachers and teacher educators. The main research kind of method is quite a long survey that we sent around to staff and students across the UK and across beyond the UK, in fact, to gather their insights into how they read and how they teach people to read in online contexts. And the kind of we've involved quite a lot of student researchers both at Lincoln and at other institutions to kind of gather both their insights into how they read, but also to get them to do some of the kind of data gathering and data analysis for us, including Samantha and Annabelle, who are here today. Can we move on to the next slide, Ben? So in total, we got over 400 responses from students and nearly 100 from staff across a variety of institutions and countries. At Lincoln, we got 97 responses, which is by far the most that we received from students, and just over 20 from staff. So we got a good number of responses. So I think some of the stuff that we've got to say here is going to be meaningful. And what we're going to report on over the next few slides are kind of Lincoln-specific findings. Yeah, can we move on now? And there's a link there if you want to find out more about the project. So one of the questions we asked staff was how important, we asked them to rate the importance of online reading to students learning within their discipline. And in general, they were pretty positive about it. They thought that it was important. Whether or not they were positive about it is another thing. So hardly anyone said that it wasn't particularly important. So there was a consensus on the importance of online reading. It's seen as important by the majority of staff across all disciplines, and that extends beyond Lincoln. Many people set all of the readings that they asked their students to do in a digital format. And one of the key things that our respondents emphasised was like accessibility as being a key driver for using online readings, and a perception that it's kind of lower cost as well. Can we move on, Ben? Contrary to like the kind of importance that was given to online reading, when we asked colleagues to rate the effectiveness of students' online reading process, we kind of got the reverse result. It's super important, but we got a kind of that colleagues felt that online reading skills and practices and academic reading in general wasn't particularly effective. So they thought that students had a deficit in this area, even though it was important. Next slide, please, Ben. When we ask students to rate the kind of importance of, or to talk about the advantages of online reading for their studies. We got some similar responses to what we'd received from staff. So talking about accessibility, it's low cost, they can do it anywhere and any time. So things around convenience really, and that the fact that online tools can integrate with other online or digital tools that students are using. So it enables them to kind of work across platforms. What we saw as well was students emphasised where it was possible for them to engage in direct annotations of readings, and that wasn't everywhere. They rated that as a benefit. So where they were able to kind of work directly with readings, they liked that. What the kind of pie chart on there shows is we asked students to tell us how much time they spent reading for all of their classes on a weekly basis. So the total amount of reading they did across a week. And we think quite, well, I wasn't particularly surprised, but quite a low number. Most students read for between 0 and 10 hours when in preparation for class, which I think is less than probably I would be expecting for history, certainly, and maybe many of us would expect, or like at least ideally expect. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Ben? What we also asked were questions around how students felt about that practice of annotation, how they felt about sharing their thoughts on reading versus what they felt about reading what others had thought. And interestingly, results at Lincoln were divergent from what we found from the kind of total number of people we asked. So in the overall survey, students felt much more comfortable reading the thoughts of others than sharing their own. Whereas when we asked the Lincoln students, there was a bit more comfort around sharing their own thoughts with others, which is a kind of surprising given students' general reluctance to engage in kind of that sort of activity that kind of opens themselves up to kind of makes themselves visible. So I think that's something interesting that we want to explore in more detail. Next slide, please, Ben. We also asked staff and students about their practices and pedagogies. When we asked staff about how they encourage students to engage in reading, we got sort of 3 categories of answers. The most popular was it was all about the selection of materials, perhaps accompanied by some guidance or questions. So it's about kind of the readings themselves. The second most popular was, I think, more focused on the pedagogy. So about the specific methods they used, what they would do in class in order to cultivate desired reading attributes. And thirdly, it was more about kind of telling students. It was about emphasizing through writing or through talking to students about the value of academic reading and reading online effectively. So there's kind of 3 different categories, and it was interesting to me that only one of those is really purely about the pedagogy. The others are more about the text themselves, or very kind of teacher focused, telling the students what to do. Okay, move on to the next one, please, Ben. When we asked students, we got a kind of some interesting responses too about their practices of online reading, and there was a variety of kind of responses. For first-year students, it's overwhelmingly something that's done, stated as being done in preparation for class. It's not something that's done in terms of reviewing reading afterwards, and that seems to be a difference between first years and others. There's definitely, the students articulated a strong relationship between their reading practice and their note-taking practices, which you can see on some of the quotes on this slide. And the references to online reading, I mean, perhaps because of the nature of the survey and what we were asking them, but they're much more focused on online reading than offline or physical reading. So it's clear that the way in which students access reading, whether they eventually do it through printing it off or whatever, is done kind of through technology. Okay, final slide, Ben. I didn't think I could do this in 10 minutes, but I think I have. I think, summing up, there's something around access and cost, or expectations of those things, that is driving increasing take-up of online reading. There's a balance between our expectations and the realities of what students are actually doing in terms of our expectations of how much they should read, the importance of reading, versus how much they report that they actually do. So there's also a balance between what we are requiring of them or expecting them to do, and what we're actually teaching them to do, which is something we want to dig in more through the project. Lots of responses talk about distraction and the strain on the eyes and things like that. So there's a kind of physical side to the online reading as well, and digital distraction is an issue. Clearly, students who responded to the survey value the opportunity to kind of engage in shared collaborative reading. They report that as having a positive impact on their learning. And there are issues that we want to unpack as we move through this around transition from school to university, that making that transition in terms of reading practices and skills students how to read online is something we're going to be looking at as we delve deeper into this data. And there's also specifically around not just teaching students generic reading skills, but teaching them how to read specifically within a discipline is something that we think is the responses that we've looked at reveal as a little bit lacking, and something that we need to work on further. So I think that took about 10 minutes, and we're very happy to answer questions. Annabelle and Samantha did the analysis of the student and staff data responses to the survey, so they'll be in a good position to answer those questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Annabelle. And Samantha, sorry. So whilst we're waiting for anyone to raise a hand and questions, I think someone just come through. I'll take chair's prerogative and ask the question first. You mentioned that Lincoln students seem to buck the trend in terms of engagement. And you've looked at the data, and I know you want to explore more there, but maybe ask Annabelle and Samantha to comment. Any reason why that you've been able to determine why that would be the case in terms of why that they had that surprising result? And it's a big question.
I will tackle that one from the get-go. I think personally, from a student perspective, from day one, we've been using Talus Elevate and collaborative platforms to annotate readings, which I think, comparing to some of the responses from students at other universities, is a massive difference to their student experience. So we've sort of had that collaboration and that sharing of ideas and thoughts whilst reading from our very first days at university. So it's been sort of easier for us to adapt to it, and thus easier for us to find the benefit and just the advantages of it. So I think the platforms that we've been using from the get-go at university have definitely benefited us in that regard.
So there's a familiarity and comfort differential.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Lisa's put a question in the chat. Did you have any situations where the readings weren't able to be made available online? And how did you manage that?
I think that's probably a question for the two of you, as your own experiences, really.
Sorry, Annabelle, I don't know if I want to take this one, but just from my experience as well, as a student, all my reading's been online, but reading the responses on the surveys, I didn't encounter any students who'd specifically been unable to access readings, and also I hadn't encountered any responses from staff who said that they weren't able to provide online readings. I think there's definitely a lot of responses acknowledge that there's been a big push within libraries to digitize a lot of their resources. Annabelle, I'm not sure if any of your data followed that trend as well.
Yeah, I did find that. And with the responses, I think where accessibility was a problem was definitely more with like physical resources rather than the online texts. Although you do notice that some people seem to be unwilling to find stuff themselves. So with a lot of the cases, readings had to be like handed to students quite clearly, often emailed with PDFs, etc. Just from what I found from my specific analysis.